Racist cop kicks black couple. Out of luxury hotel, regrets it when she learns their secret. In this eye-opening video, we delve into a shocking incident that occurred at a renowned luxury hotel. A black couple, simply looking to enjoy a peaceful getaway, found themselves facing an unexpected and appalling situation. As they checked into the hotel, they were met with unwarranted hostility from a racist cop who was called to the scene. If you are enthusiastic about this narrative, please inform us. If you appreciated the video, press 1. If not, select 0. Your feedback genuinely motivates me to collect additional uplifting and significant narratives.
Had earned the right to be there. The waitstaff, dressed in pristine black suits with white gloves, moved silently around the room, their every action precise and graceful. The menu, a masterpiece in itself, featured exotic dishes with prices that seemed to reflect the luxury that this place exuded. For many, it was a dream to dine here. A place reserved for the elite, where everyone from film stars to corporate moguls mingled in an atmosphere where wealth, prestige, and power converged. For Jordan and Alicia, this was the culmination of months of hard work, their celebratory dinner marking a significant milestone in their lives. They had saved up to enjoy this moment, wanting to experience the very best, the finest, and the most prestigious meal they could afford. Jordan and Alicia had been together for years. They were the kind of couple that seemed to have it all: intelligent, ambitious, and driven. Jordan, a successful entrepreneur in his early 30s, carried himself with a quiet confidence. His tailored suit fit perfectly, and he exuded an air of sophistication and accomplishment. He was the kind of man who had worked hard to build his career, and his success was evident in his calm, collected demeanor. Alicia, on the other hand, was a lawyer. Tall, poised, and equally stylish, she wore an elegant evening gown that shimmered softly under the restaurant's lights. She was known for her intellect, her precision, and her ability to navigate the world of corporate law with ease. Together, they made a formidable pair, strong, independent, and with a shared commitment to their careers and each other. This evening wasn't just about dining at a fine restaurant. It was a celebration of everything they had achieved together. Perhaps it was their anniversary, or perhaps it was the recent success of a business venture Jordan had launched. Whatever the occasion, they were eager to experience something beyond their ordinary lives, something extraordinary. They wanted to savor the high-end experience, to feel what it was like to belong to this world of exclusivity. When Jordan and Alicia walked into the restaurant, they were met with a brief but noticeable pause from the maitre d'. It wasn't an obvious reaction, no loud gasp or stares, but it was enough to make the couple feel as if they were under a subtle scrutiny. After a quick glance at their reservation details, the maitre d' offered them a table, though there was a slight hesitation in his actions, as if he was trying to process their presence there. The staff was polite, the ambience stunning, and at first, the couple felt like any other patrons, welcomed and respected. They were led to their table, passing other diners who seemed absorbed in their meals and conversations. The evening was still new, and the promise of a delightful experience hung in the air. They were shown to their seats with the expected grace of a high-end establishment. A waiter swiftly poured them water, another offered them the wine list, and for a moment, everything felt as it should. However, as they settled into the luxurious surroundings, a subtle but undeniable feeling of discomfort began to creep in. It started with a few glances, other diners subtly looking over at them, their eyes lingering just a bit too long. At first, Jordan and Alicia brushed it off. They were nervous, after all. This was a new experience for them, and perhaps they were imagining things. But as they sat down, there was no mistaking the tension that seemed to build in the air. It wasn't just the glances, they were used to those. It wasn't even the whispers they occasionally caught in the background. It was the way the staff seemed to treat them with a slightly different tone than the other guests. The waiter was polite but distant. The smile was a little more strained. And when another guest at the nearby table was greeted with laughter and casual conversation, Jordan and Alicia couldn't help but feel that something wasn't quite right. At first, it was so subtle that it was easy to ignore. But the feeling kept growing, like an uncomfortable itch they couldn't scratch. They were aware of their surroundings, of the luxurious setting, the expensive decor, and the clientele that surrounded them. But now it felt as though they didn't belong. They had been welcomed, yes, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were outsiders in a world that wasn't quite made for people like them. The air of exclusivity that once felt inviting now seemed a little more suffocating. The subtle biases that Jordan and Alicia had encountered in their lives, microaggressions, stares, awkward silences, were now manifesting in this high-end restaurant. It wasn't loud or overt, but the discomfort was undeniable. They had spent months saving to be there, to experience a world that felt just out of reach. And now, with every glance, every awkward smile, it felt as though the world was closing in around them. The couple tried to dismiss the unease. Maybe they were imagining things. Maybe they were just nervous. But deep down, they knew what they were feeling wasn't just in their heads. The subtle, invisible wall between them and the other patrons was growing higher, and they were beginning to feel like they didn't belong in a place that was supposed to be welcoming to all. In that moment, the excitement of the evening started to fade, replaced by an unsettling awareness that would shape the rest of their experience. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about something far more important. The feeling of being judged, the discomfort of being treated as if they were out of place, even when they had every right to be there. Officer Rachel Clark was a woman who held her position in high regard. In her late 30s, she had been hired as part of the private security team for the luxury restaurant, known for its reputation of exclusivity and its regular celebrity clientele. Her role was not only to maintain safety but also to preserve the polished image of the establishment. She had a no-nonsense attitude that matched the atmosphere of the place she worked in. To her, the restaurant wasn't just a high-end dining venue. It was an institution, and any potential threat to its image, no matter how minor, had to be nipped in the bud. Clark was known for her unwavering attention to detail. She had a reputation for being stern, and her presence alone often made staff members stiffen. To them, she was unapproachable, always on the lookout for anything that might disrupt the perfect illusion the restaurant worked so hard to create. Whether it was a loose thread on a guest's coat or an overly familiar interaction between a patron and a waiter, she would always make sure it was dealt with quickly. There was no room for error in her world, and the restaurant's image was her highest priority. Despite her role in security, Clark rarely got involved in any real security issues. Instead, her attention was often on appearances, ensuring that the clientele looked the part and that everything remained pristine. It wasn't about protecting the guests so much as it was about maintaining the exclusivity that came with being part of the high-class crowd. And on this evening, Officer Clark's watchful eye was particularly sharp. She didn't miss anything, especially when it came to making sure that the wrong kind of people didn't feel too comfortable in places where they didn't belong. From her station near the entrance, Officer Clark first noticed Jordan and Alicia as they walked through the restaurant's grand doors. Her eyes lingered on them for a few moments longer than necessary, an instinctive reaction. They were impeccably dressed, Jordan in a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, and Alicia in an elegant evening gown that shimmered with understated beauty. They didn't stand out for any reason that one might assume. Nothing about them screamed out of place, but Clark's gaze told a different story. She scanned them as they walked across the room, scrutinizing their every move. They were well-dressed, yes. They moved with confidence, but there was something about them that unsettled her. It wasn't the way they looked. It was the way they blended so effortlessly into the high-end crowd. She had expected them to draw attention for some reason, perhaps by acting out of place, or maybe by looking like they didn't belong. But no, they seemed poised and at ease, and that made her uncomfortable. The smoothness with which they glided past her, like any other well-dressed patrons, left her with an unshakable sense of doubt. Something about them felt wrong, like they didn't belong in the world she was sworn to protect. Her gaze shifted to the staff, noticing that a few of the waiters had exchanged glances. She couldn't tell if it was just her own unease influencing her, but it seemed like the staff was uncomfortable too. There were small, almost imperceptible movements. A waiter quickly averting their eyes when Jordan made eye contact, another waiter's soft chuckle that seemed too forced. It didn't take long for Clark to feel that this was more than a coincidence. Something was off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She made a mental note of their appearance and their demeanor as they settled into their seats. The couple didn't cause a stir. They weren't loud or drawing attention to themselves. But the unease that Clark felt was only growing stronger. She couldn't shake the feeling that they might be a problem, even though they had done nothing to indicate that. The evening began smoothly. Alicia and Jordan, still basking in the excitement of their special night, settled into the plush booth, discussing everything from their business ventures to their plans for the future. They were in their own world, enjoying the atmosphere and the luxurious food that was presented before them. The service was impeccable, as one would expect from a restaurant of this caliber, and the wine list was extensive, offering choices that only added to the sense of exclusivity. At first, everything seemed perfect. The menu was a work of art, and the dishes came out precisely as they had hoped. Each course was a new delight, fresh, flavorful, and perfectly prepared. But something started to shift as the night wore on. While the couple was savoring their meal, they began to notice a subtle difference in the way they were being treated. The waiters, though polite, seemed distant. Their service was efficient, but there was an underlying coldness to it that wasn't there when other guests were served. For instance, when they asked for a recommendation for a wine pairing, their waiter gave them a short answer before quickly walking away, not offering further conversation or the warmth that others seemed to receive. As they glanced around, they saw other guests being treated differently, more attentively. A couple at the nearby table was laughing and chatting with their waiter, who was engaging with them on a personal level, offering recommendations and sharing jokes. The contrast wasn't lost on Jordan and Alicia. They tried to ignore it at first, attributing it to nerves. After all, they were still new to this kind of experience. But as the night progressed, the disparity became harder to brush off. The warmth, the laughter, the friendly gestures, they were all reserved for the other patrons, and Jordan and Alicia felt the stark difference. It was as if, in a room full of well-dressed, polite people, they had somehow become invisible, or worse, undeserving of the same treatment. They weren't just guests, they were different. They could feel the unspoken distance. The tension that started with Clark's lingering glance now began to seep into their dining experience, making them increasingly aware of how out of place they felt. The subtle whispers from the staff became more apparent, and Alicia caught a few odd stares from the people sitting nearby. Jordan noticed the way the room's energy seemed to shift as they dined. A few patrons looked over at them, their eyes drifting away as quickly as they'd landed. It was uncomfortable, and for the first time that evening, the couple began to feel the weight of something unspoken, the quiet judgment of others. As the meal progressed, they tried to shake off the discomfort. It wasn't their fault that the restaurant wasn't offering the same warmth to them as it did to others. But the looks from the staff, the whispered words between waiters, and the lingering sense that they weren't quite welcome in a space meant for the elite began to chip away at the enjoyment of the evening. Everything was starting to feel off. They had come to this restaurant for an extraordinary experience, a celebration of their hard work and success, but instead, they were slowly being made to feel like outsiders. And as the night stretched on, Jordan couldn't ignore the creeping realization that the tension in the air wasn't just coming from the restaurant's atmosphere, it was coming from within. Something was about to happen, and they both knew it. It was right in the middle of their meal when the atmosphere at the table shifted. Jordan and Alicia were enjoying their conversation, laughing and reminiscing about old memories, letting the world outside their little bubble fade away. But then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the air grew thick with tension. Officer Rachel Clark, who had been quietly observing from the periphery of the restaurant, made her move. Her steps were purposeful, her uniform crisp, and her presence was commanding. She walked confidently towards the couple's table, her gaze fixed on them like a hawk watching its prey. As she approached, Alicia and Jordan exchanged confused looks, unaware of what was about to unfold. Without warning, Officer Clark interrupted their conversation with a sharp "excuse me" that cut through the air like a knife. Her voice was cold, her expression unreadable, as if her presence alone should have been enough to silence any questions. Standing tall and unbothered, she looked down at the couple, her eyes never wavering. The kind of authority she carried made it clear that she wasn't about to entertain any pleasantries. It was immediately clear that this wasn't a social visit. "Can I help you?" Jordan asked, trying to remain composed. He glanced up at Clark, his confusion only growing as she stood in front of him, blocking the table with an air of authority. Clark didn't respond directly to his question. Instead, she wasted no time getting to the point. You two shouldn't be here, she said matter-of-factly, as if it was the most obvious statement in the world. This is a restricted area. Jordan's eyebrows furrowed, and Alicia's hand tightened around her wine glass. What are you talking about? Jordan asked, now visibly confused. We have a reservation here. We've been seated at this table for over an hour. But Officer Clark wasn't interested in their explanation. Her gaze didn't soften, and she continued with her accusations. I need to see your reservation details, she demanded, her tone harsh. I'm not sure you're supposed to be here. You're not the type of guests we usually have in this section. The words stung, but they made no sense. Alicia and Jordan had made the reservation weeks ago. They had dressed for the occasion as any patron would in a high-end restaurant. They were paying guests, just like everyone else in the restaurant. But now, with Clark standing before them, everything they had thought to be true about their night seemed to crumble. Jordan pulled out his phone and opened the confirmation email. He showed it to Clark, who barely glanced at it before dismissively turning away. I don't care about your confirmation, she said, her voice rising slightly. I need to know if you're really here as proper patrons. If you're not, I'll have to ask you to leave. Alicia's stomach twisted in knots. Proper patrons, she repeated, trying to keep her voice steady, though her frustration was evident. We made a reservation. We're paying customers. What do you mean by proper patrons? Clark's eyes narrowed, and she crossed her arms over her chest. Her body language made it clear that she had already made up her mind. You're clearly not the kind of people who belong here, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I'm not sure if you've used fake IDs or if you're just pretending to be something you're not, but I can't allow you to continue sitting here. The words hit hard. Alicia's face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She had worked so hard to get to this point in her life. This night was supposed to be a celebration, not a public humiliation. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, Jordan quickly stepped in. Ma'am, there has to be some mistake, he said, trying to keep his voice calm, though his fists were clenched under the table. We've been here for over an hour. We're not causing any trouble. We're just trying to enjoy a nice meal. Alicia nodded, trying to stay calm despite the injustice she felt. Please, we've done everything by the book. There's no need for this. We are not here to cause a scene. But Officer Clark wasn't hearing any of it. Her attitude only grew more aggressive, her eyes flashing with something more than just suspicion. I don't care about your excuses, she said sharply. If you're here under false pretenses, you'll have to leave. Now. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control, and it felt as if the walls were closing in on them. Alicia tried to maintain her composure, but the officer's dismissive attitude only made her frustration grow. She turned to the waitstaff, hoping for some kind of support or intervention, but it was clear they were too afraid to speak up. Jordan, who had been trying to keep the peace, stood up suddenly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He was fed up. Listen, this is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising. We have a right to be here. We've done everything right. There's no reason for you to treat us like this. Alicia's hand instinctively went to his arm, trying to calm him down, but before either of them could say anything else, Officer Clark raised her voice, her words carrying across the room. I'm calling security. If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have no choice but to escort you out myself. The words echoed in their ears, but they didn't make sense. Everything about this night had been perfect up until now, but in an instant, it felt like everything was falling apart. How could someone be so determined to make them feel like they didn't belong? Why was Clark so set on pushing them out when they had done nothing wrong? The tension in the air was palpable. Other diners were starting to notice the exchange, their conversations slowing down as they glanced over to witness the confrontation. Some of the staff had paused in the background, unsure of what to do. No one came to the couple's defense, and the isolation they felt in that moment was overwhelming. It was as if their entire presence had become a spectacle, something others felt uncomfortable with, but were too afraid to challenge. As Officer Clark turned and walked away to call for backup, Alicia and Jordan shared a look of disbelief. They had tried to remain calm, tried to understand that maybe this was just a misunderstanding, but it was becoming clear that this was more than just a case of mistaken identity. This was something deeper, something about who they were, and how they were perceived in a place that prided itself on exclusivity. With the looming threat of security arriving, the couple's anniversary dinner had been ruined. The promise of a night to remember had turned into an experience they would never forget for all the wrong reasons. It was becoming clear to Jordan and Alicia that the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was now taking on a much darker tone. Officer Rachel Clark, still standing at their table, her eyes fixed and unrelenting, had already made up her mind. She wasn't just questioning their presence anymore, she was treating them as though they were criminals. "I'm calling for backup," Clark announced coldly, her voice loud enough for anyone in the vicinity to hear. The words seemed to hang in the air, chilling the couple to their core. They hadn't done anything wrong, nothing that justified this treatment, but somehow, that didn't matter. Within moments, a few of the restaurant's security team appeared at the entrance, walking towards the couple's table with purposeful strides. Their presence alone was enough to create a heavy, intimidating atmosphere. The crisp black uniforms and the stern faces of the security guards made it clear that they were there to remove the couple. It didn't matter that they were guests, that they had reservations, or that they'd been quietly enjoying their dinner just minutes before. They were now being treated like they were trespassing, like they didn't belong. Jordan could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm, to handle any situation with poise, but this was different. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a polite conversation. This was something deeper, something racial. His stomach churned as he realized just how uncomfortable they both were. Alicia, too, seemed frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. Clark's posture was rigid, her arms crossed over her chest. "You're trespassing," she stated again, this time with even more force. "I've already warned you. If you don't leave right now, I'll have to call the police." The words stung more than anything else. Trespassing? They were paying customers, sitting at a table they had reserved for weeks. There was no reason for them to be treated like this, except for one clear reason that neither of them wanted to admit. This was racial profiling, pure and simple. The realization hit them both like a ton of bricks, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. "I'm not going anywhere," Jordan said firmly, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and frustration. "We're not doing anything wrong. We have a reservation." Clark's response was swift and sharp. "It's not about your reservation. It's about whether or not you belong here." Her voice was filled with contempt, the implication clear. People like them didn't belong in a place like this. They were out of place, and she wasn't going to let them forget it. Alicia clenched her jaw, her fingers trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. She had wanted this night to be special, a celebration of their hard work and accomplishments. But now, it felt like all of it was being ripped away by someone who didn't even know them, someone who was determined to make them feel unwelcome. As the security guards began to move in closer, the couple's sense of isolation deepened. They could feel the eyes of the other diners on them, the subtle shift in the room's energy as the scene unfolded. Some people were watching with clear disapproval, shaking their heads in silent judgment. Others were whispering to each other, their hushed voices betraying their discomfort, though none of them intervened. Alicia caught the gaze of one woman who was watching them intently, her eyes filled with curiosity, but there was no sympathy in them. The woman quickly looked away, as if embarrassed to be associated with what was happening. The sense of alienation was overwhelming, like they were under a microscope, and everyone was silently weighing whether or not they were deserving of being in this space. But the worst part wasn't the whispers or the stares. It was the feeling of helplessness. They were guests, paying customers, yet they felt like they were being treated like criminals. It was as if their mere presence was a threat to the status quo. Alicia finally found her voice, though it was shaking with frustration. "Why are we being treated like this?" she asked, her eyes locking onto Officer Clark's. "What did we do wrong? We've been here for over an hour. We have a reservation. We're not causing any problems." Clark didn't even flinch at the question. Her response was quick, almost dismissive. "You don't belong here. This isn't your kind of place. You should know that." The words cut through Alicia like a knife. There was no attempt to even hide the bias in her statement. It was as if everything Alicia and Jordan had accomplished, everything they had worked for, was irrelevant. None of that mattered to Officer Clark. What mattered was their appearance, their race. Jordan could feel the anger rising in him, threatening to take over. He had worked hard for everything he had, and yet here he was, standing in a place he had every right to be, treated like an outsider by someone who was supposed to be upholding fairness, not judgment. He clenched his fists and stood up, his voice no longer quiet but filled with a firm resolve. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "We are paying customers. We've done nothing wrong, and we are not leaving until we've had a chance to speak with someone in charge." Alicia stood up with him, her hand on his arm as they both faced Officer Clark. They weren't about to back down. Not now, not after everything that had happened. But just as the tension seemed like it would boil over, they heard a voice behind them. "Is everything all right here?" It was the restaurant manager, a woman in her mid-40s, wearing a professional but somewhat uneasy expression. She had clearly heard the commotion and now stood in the doorway of the restaurant, looking at the scene with a mixture of concern and confusion. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be a misunderstanding," the manager said, her eyes shifting between the couple and Officer Clark. "Can we talk about this for a moment?" Jordan's heart sank as he saw the manager's eyes flicker briefly to Officer Clark before focusing back on them. It was clear the officer had already painted a certain picture of them to the manager. They weren't just customers anymore. They were the problem. Alicia could feel her blood boiling. This was not how they had envisioned their evening, and now it was clear they would be fighting not just to finish their dinner, but to defend their very dignity. As the manager stepped closer, she tried to smooth things over with a few apologetic words, but the damage was already done. The couple felt humiliated, isolated, and more than anything, trapped. Despite the manager's attempts to calm things down, there was no mistaking the truth of what was happening. They were being pushed out, not because they had done anything wrong, but simply because they didn't belong in this space. And as the situation continued to escalate, it was clear to Jordan and Alicia that the night was lost, and so was a piece of their trust in the world they had worked so hard to be a part of. The tension in the air was thick, the kind of discomfort that settles deep in your chest, making it hard to breathe. Jordan and Alicia were still standing at their table, flanked by Officer Clark and the security team, as the restaurant manager, Ellen Matthews, walked briskly toward them. She had heard the commotion from across the room, and it was clear from the look on her face that she wasn't happy about what was unfolding. Matthews was a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a sharp suit that looked polished and professional. Her demeanor was calm, but there was an obvious tension in her body as she approached the table. As soon as her eyes landed on Clark, the officer's rigid posture and the defensive stance she had taken toward the couple, Matthews seemed to understand that something had gone terribly wrong. She glanced quickly at the couple, then back at Clark, clearly aware of the uncomfortable scene she was walking into. "I'm Ellen Matthews," the manager said, introducing herself in a voice that was calm but authoritative. "I'm the manager here. What's going on?" Clark, without missing a beat, stood straighter and looked at Matthews with a hint of defiance. "I'm handling this. These two don't belong here. They've been asked to leave." Matthews took a deep breath and glanced at Jordan and Alicia. She could see the confusion and hurt in their eyes, the way they were standing, still holding on to some shred of dignity despite everything that had just happened. She knew at that moment the couple had every right to be angry and upset. "Let's calm down," Matthews said, her voice low and steady, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. "I'll take a look at the reservation, and we'll sort this out." She turned toward the couple, her gaze softer than Clark's had been. "I'm sorry for the confusion. I can see that you've been treated unfairly." Alicia wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice trembling as she responded. "We've done nothing wrong. We just want to enjoy our night like everyone else. We've been waiting for this, and this is how we're treated." Jordan placed a hand on Alicia's shoulder, trying to steady her. He was upset too, but his focus was on getting to the bottom of what was happening. "We have a reservation," he said, his voice calm but laced with frustration. "We've been here for over an hour. Why are we being treated like this?" Matthews nodded, taking out her phone to check the reservation list. After a few moments, she confirmed what the couple already knew. Their reservation was indeed valid. "I've checked," she said, turning back to Clark. "They are on the list." Their reservation was made weeks ago. At this point, it was clear that Matthews was trying to resolve the situation, but Clark was not backing down. Her posture was still stiff, arms crossed, and her eyes narrowed, refusing to acknowledge the obvious mistake. She shot a glance at the couple, then back at Matthews, and in a sharp tone said, "I'm just doing my job. They shouldn't be here." Matthews sighed, clearly frustrated but trying to maintain professionalism. "Officer Clark, we've gone over this. These guests are legitimate customers, and they are welcome here. I need you to stand down." But Clark was relentless. "I've seen them before. People like them don't belong in places like this." Her words were sharp, cutting through the tense air like a blade. Matthews flinched but quickly regained her composure. She turned toward the couple, offering a sincere, if somewhat uncomfortable, smile. "I am so sorry for this. We want you to feel welcome here, and I can assure you that this won't happen again. Please accept our sincerest apologies." Despite her words, Alicia was having a hard time swallowing the apology. She was visibly shaken, her shoulders hunched in disbelief, the tears that had been falling freely now starting to slow. She shook her head slowly, looking at Matthews. "How could you let this happen? This isn't just an apology. It's bigger than that. We've been treated like criminals for no reason at all." Jordan's anger flared again, but he stayed calm, trying not to lose control. "This is beyond just a mistake. This is discrimination. She doesn't even see us as people, just something to get rid of because we don't fit her idea of who belongs in a high-end restaurant. I want you to understand that. She's been harassing us for no reason." Matthews glanced at Clark, her face hardening for a moment. "I understand," she said quietly, though there was still a hesitation in her voice. "I want to make this right. We can offer you a complimentary meal tonight, and I'll personally ensure this doesn't happen again. If you would like, I'll also arrange for someone to speak with you after the meal to make sure this issue is fully addressed." But the offer, no matter how generous, didn't land the way Matthews probably hoped. Alicia glanced at Jordan, her frustration mounting as she wiped her eyes again. She didn't want a free meal. She wanted an apology that mattered, an acknowledgement that what had just happened was wrong. "It's not about the food," Alicia said, her voice shaking but firm. "We've been humiliated in front of an entire room of people. You think a free meal is going to fix that?" Jordan nodded in agreement, his voice steady as he spoke. "This is more than just a mistake. It's about the way people like us are treated in spaces like this. We don't belong in these places because of how we look, how we dress, because of the color of our skin. That's what we're dealing with here." Matthews took a moment, her eyes dropping to the ground as if processing their words. She clearly wasn't used to being confronted like this, not at her high-end restaurant, where everything was supposed to be perfect, where things like this weren't supposed to happen. But they had. "I am truly sorry," Matthews said again, her voice softer this time. "I understand how wrong this is, and we will do everything we can to make it right." But the damage had been done. No matter how many times Matthews apologized, no matter what she offered, the hurt was deep. Alicia and Jordan were left standing in a restaurant they had hoped would be a place of celebration, but now, it was tainted by the ugliness of prejudice. The rest of the night passed in a blur for the couple. The security team eventually dispersed, but their presence still lingered in the air, reminding them of what had happened. And while they tried to push past it, enjoying the meal they had once been excited about, the emotional toll of the evening weighed heavily on them both. As they finished their meal in silence, Jordan finally spoke up, his voice quiet but resolute. "We won't forget this. Not for a long time." Alicia nodded, wiping away the last of her tears. "And we won't let it go. This is bigger than just us." They left the restaurant with mixed feelings, grateful for the manager's intervention but still reeling from the injustice they had faced. What was supposed to be a special evening had turned into a painful reminder of the ongoing fight against discrimination, and the couple knew they couldn't let that fight go unnoticed. The night at the restaurant was supposed to be a celebration, but what had unfolded instead was a nightmare that neither Alicia nor Jordan would ever forget. What was meant to be a quiet, romantic dinner to mark a milestone in their lives had quickly turned into a public spectacle. The racial profiling, the humiliation, the feeling of being trapped in an environment where they weren't wanted. These were the memories that would linger. But the story didn't end when they walked out of that restaurant. It had only just begun to unfold, and soon, the whole world would know what had happened. Alicia and Jordan weren't the type of people to shy away from standing up for what was right, especially when it involved something as blatant as racial discrimination. As soon as they were back in the safety of their home, they decided to take action. Alicia, ever the advocate, took out her phone and started typing. She poured her emotions into a long post, telling the story of what had happened that evening, how they had been treated unfairly, how Officer Clark had profiled them and made them feel like criminals simply because of the color of their skin. Her words were raw, honest, and heartfelt. She described the exact moment when they realized they were being discriminated against, the shock that ran through their veins as Officer Clark had approached them with that judgmental tone, and how, despite their attempts to explain themselves, the situation only worsened. Alicia didn't hold back. She described the humiliation, the isolation, and the pain of being made to feel like they didn't belong in a space they had every right to occupy. Jordan, after reading Alicia's post, added his own thoughts. He spoke about the way the security team had arrived, the heavy atmosphere, and the way they were treated like criminals despite being paying customers. He wrote about how it felt to know that no matter how successful you are, no matter how hard you work, your worth is still questioned by others who look at you and see only your skin color. The couple published the post on their personal social media accounts, not knowing just how far their story would spread. But it didn't take long for it to go viral. Friends, family, and complete strangers began to share it. The post was passed around, retweeted, and reposted. People from all walks of life began commenting, offering their support, and sharing similar experiences of being treated unfairly in elite spaces. They had found a voice, a way to speak out against the discrimination that so often goes unnoticed or ignored. The flood of support was overwhelming. Strangers sent messages of encouragement, telling Alicia and Jordan they weren't alone, that their experience mattered, and that change needed to come. But it wasn't just the support from individuals that flooded in. Many public figures, activists, and influencers started speaking out about the incident. They used their platforms to amplify the couple's message, shining a light on the reality of racial profiling in high-end spaces and institutions. Soon, the media picked up on the story. News outlets from across the country ran segments about the incident. The footage from the restaurant was aired, showing the couple's confrontation with Officer Clark, and experts weighed in on the larger issue of racial discrimination in places that were supposed to be elite and exclusive. The restaurant, once a symbol of luxury, found itself at the center of a media storm. The public response was swift and unforgiving. People started calling for boycotts of the restaurant, and many vowed to avoid it until it addressed the issue properly. The hashtag Justice for Jordan and Alicia began trending, with thousands of people using it to share their own stories of discrimination and racism in high-end spaces. The restaurant's response, however, left much to be desired. They issued a public apology on social media, but it was vague and didn't go into much detail. The apology expressed regret for the unfortunate incident and promised to look into the matter. There was no mention of Officer Clark or any specific actions being taken. It was clear to many that the restaurant was trying to distance itself from the incident without taking full responsibility for what had occurred. The backlash only grew stronger. People criticized the restaurant for its lack of accountability. It wasn't enough to offer a generic apology. It was clear that more needed to be done. People wanted to know what steps the restaurant would take to ensure that something like this would never happen again. They wanted answers, and they weren't getting them. While the social media backlash continued to gain momentum, Alicia and Jordan were left grappling with their own emotions and deciding what their next steps would be. They had felt violated, humiliated, and powerless in that moment at the restaurant, but now they had a choice. They could either let the incident slide or take action to ensure that they, and others like them, were never treated this way again. After much discussion, they decided to consult with legal experts. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they both agreed that this wasn't just about them anymore. This was about sending a message that racial discrimination, especially in places of privilege, needed to be addressed and stopped. They met with a civil rights attorney who had handled discrimination cases before. The attorney listened intently as they recounted the events of that night, from their arrival at the restaurant to the moment they were told to leave. Alicia explained how Officer Clark had profiled them and how the restaurant had failed to step in and correct the situation. Jordan spoke about the emotional toll the incident had taken on both of them, the sense of helplessness and anger that had built up throughout the night. The attorney explained the legal options they had. They could file a lawsuit for racial discrimination, emotional distress, and even for the damage done to their reputations. The attorney made it clear that they had a strong case. It was clear that the restaurant had allowed racial profiling to take place under its roof, and Officer Clark's actions had been discriminatory. Alicia and Jordan took some time to think about the next steps. They knew that a lawsuit could take months, even years, to resolve. They also knew that they would likely face a lot of public scrutiny, especially from those who didn't understand why they were pursuing legal action. But in the end, they felt that it was the right thing to do. "It's not just for us," Alicia said one evening as they sat together, discussing their decision. "This is about making sure no one else has to go through what we went through. This is about showing that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated anymore." Jordan nodded in agreement. "We have to do this. It's bigger than just us. It's about fighting for everyone who's ever been made to feel less than, just because of the color of their skin." So, with the support of their attorney, Alicia and Jordan officially filed a lawsuit against the restaurant for racial discrimination, seeking damages for emotional distress and the harm done to their reputations. They also made it clear that they weren't just after money. They wanted the restaurant to take full responsibility for the actions of Officer Clark and to implement better training for their staff on racial sensitivity and discrimination. As they moved forward with the legal process, they felt both a sense of empowerment and exhaustion. It was a fight, but it was a fight worth having. They were no longer just a couple who had been wronged. They were now part of a larger movement, one that sought to make sure that no one else would ever have to face the kind of discrimination they had experienced. And though they couldn't predict how things would unfold, Alicia and Jordan knew one thing for certain. They were going to continue speaking up, continue fighting for change, and continue demanding justice for themselves and for others. Because the fight for equality and dignity didn't stop with them, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been silenced or erased because of their race. The aftermath of the incident at the high-end restaurant was not an easy journey for Alicia and Jordan. The emotional toll was still fresh, the sting of being unfairly treated lingering in their minds. The public backlash had been swift and intense, and as the days passed, the couple found themselves at the center of a much larger conversation about race, privilege, and discrimination in spaces that were meant to be elite. But now, as the dust settled and the investigation into Officer Clark's behavior progressed, Alicia and Jordan were left to reflect on what had happened and whether any real change would come from it. After the initial shock of the incident wore off, the restaurant began to address the situation. Officer Clark, who had been hired to ensure the restaurant's exclusivity and manage security, was put on administrative leave as the hotel conducted its internal investigation. It didn't take long for the restaurant to uncover Clark's history of similar actions. The investigation revealed that she had, in fact, been involved in multiple incidents of racial profiling at other venues and had shown a consistent pattern of bias towards Black patrons. The restaurant's management took swift action. Officer Clark was eventually terminated. On paper, it seemed like the right thing to do, a consequence for her actions. But for Alicia and Jordan, it wasn't that simple. While they were relieved to see that Clark was being held accountable, they couldn't help but feel that her termination, while necessary, was just a small piece of the puzzle. The real question was whether the restaurant and society at large would make lasting changes. Was firing one officer going to erase the deeper, systemic issues of racial profiling that were so ingrained in places of privilege? Would it change how people like them were treated when they walked into exclusive spaces? Alicia was the first to voice what both of them had been thinking. "This doesn't feel like enough," she said one evening, as the couple sat down to reflect. "Clark being fired might give us some satisfaction, but it doesn't address the larger issue. There are still so many people out there who will face the same treatment, even if Clark is gone. It's not just one person. It's a whole system that needs to be changed." Jordan nodded, understanding exactly what Alicia meant. The restaurant might have done what they had to do to protect their image, but they didn't do enough to actually fix the problem. "We're not just talking about one bad apple here. This is about the culture that allowed that to happen in the first place." The couple agreed that while Clark's firing was a step, it wasn't a solution. The issue they faced went far beyond one individual's actions. It was a symptom of a much bigger problem, one that stretched across industries and institutions, from high-end restaurants to private clubs and even corporate offices. This was a moment to spark change, but they knew it couldn't stop there. Alicia and Jordan weren't content to let the incident fade away without making sure their voices were heard. They knew they had an opportunity to do something bigger with their experience. So, they continued to speak out, using their platform to raise awareness about racial profiling in luxury spaces. They didn't want their story to be one of anger and frustration alone. They wanted it to be a call to action. Through their social media channels and public appearances, they educated their followers about the deep-seated racial bias that still existed in high-end spaces. They shared their story repeatedly, not as victims, but as individuals who had experienced a stark reality that many people of color faced every day. They spoke about how their status, success, and hard work hadn't protected them from being treated unfairly simply because of their race. They used their experience to highlight the unspoken barriers that people of color often encountered in environments where wealth and exclusivity were the main currency. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. Civil rights organizations reached out to them, offering their support and helping to amplify their message. Alicia and Jordan began working with these organizations to advocate for broader societal changes. They spoke at events, participated in panel discussions, and even collaborated with lawmakers and activists to push for stronger policies against discrimination in private establishments. Alicia often spoke passionately about the importance of education in combating racism. "We have to start by having honest conversations about race and privilege," she would say. Too many people are comfortable turning a blind eye to the ways racism plays out in everyday life. It's not enough to say you're not racist. You need to be actively anti-racist. You need to speak up when you see something wrong happening, even if it's uncomfortable. Jordan, too, had become an outspoken advocate for change. He often used his platform as a successful entrepreneur to challenge the norms of exclusivity and privilege that permeated many high-end spaces. He talked about the emotional toll that racism took on people of color, how it wasn't just an inconvenience but a constant barrier to opportunity and well-being. "People don't realize that racism isn't just a problem for the people who are being targeted," he said in one of his posts. "It's a problem for all of us. It divides us. It limits our potential. And it's something we all need to work together to change." Despite the setbacks, Alicia and Jordan were hopeful. They knew they had started something much bigger than just their individual experience. Their story had sparked a larger conversation, and they were determined to keep that conversation going. They were no longer just speaking for themselves. They were speaking for everyone who had been silenced or dismissed simply because